welcome to Even the Dog Has ADHD, because apples never fall far from trees and there's never just one. This is a podcast where people share their lived experience of what it's like to have neurodivergence within their family. Today, I'm joined by my lovely friend Cara. I met Cara several years ago at the very early stages of our diagnostic journey as a family. There was the wondering what if, or maybe going through the diagnostic process and then exploring ways of how we support neurodivergence in our family. Welcome, Cara, and thank you for coming on the show and being willing to share your story.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I was over the moon when you suggested it, and we'll see what I have to say. Yeah, see where things go. I do have ADHD myself, so I might potentially overshare because that's what we do.
It is,
but that's a good thing for this podcast, right?
yeah. So when we were chatting about it, we've often talked about how stories really help us, don't they, in terms of identifying, finding things relatable, having those aha moments ourselves. And I think we've as friends, we've often talked about our childhood and what that was like. Do you want to share a little bit about what your childhood felt like for you growing up?
Yeah, so I can remember feeling frustrated a lot of the time and dysregulated. I can remember, kind of having big fights with my sisters and pinching them and kicking them and just generally having outbursts. My mum would always describe me as really grumpy, which is like opposite to how my dad would describe me. He always described me as a really happy child. And my educational experiences were pretty bad. So at primary school, for example, they kind of said to the teacher said to my mother, well, she's not very bright, but she's happy, and that's the important thing. so I was always pegged as this kind of not very bright child that I couldn't read. I struggled generally with learning. I struggled with the classroom environment, but I had lots of friends. I did, lots of different activities. I was always involved in things. So when I was a child, neurodiversity wasn't really a thing. It wasn't, something many people knew about. Dyslexia was just starting to show up in education. Teachers were starting to kind of understand and learn about that. But otherwise it was, you were just kind of pegged as not very bright.
Early adulthood, what was life like for you as a young woman?
So again, the dysregulation kind of continued. I had kind of episodes of self-harm. I just couldn't cope with my emotions. I was a big ball. I was very kind of extreme. I'm amazed, actually, really, I'm still alive with some of the things that I ended up getting involved in or getting into trouble with. So it's a miracle I'm still here.
Yeah. Now, I'm just wondering where we go. So things. You were just about to get married. You had 2 children. You had just come through kind of a big health thing. Do you want to talk a little bit about that time in the run up to say when you were getting married around that time?
Yeah, I mean, we could, or we could go back a little bit further in terms of, my dyslexia diagnosis, because that was the first thing that came up. And that was really at university.
Okay.
So where throughout my childhood, my mother would always be saying to the teachers, there's something not right. She is very bright, but something's not working. And my parents were very supportive, really, of me, and they paid for private tuition with a specialist speech and language therapist who kind of, and then later on a specialist dyslexia tutor, even though I didn't have a diagnosis at that point. But they did that for a few years, and that really helped me to get through school and make it to university. And then when I got to university, I made it through the first year, and then the lecturers suggested that I should maybe go to the disability student services, and as a result of that they sent me to an educational psychologist, and they diagnosed me with dyslexia. And so that was quite a revelation really at that point.
Yeah.
You're going to ask something, sorry.
Yeah, no, so I just wanted to have a little bridge in my mind from kind of early childhood where they were kind of saying, oh, you've got lots of friends, but you're not that bright. But your parents could see that you were struggling, could see that potential. So I'm guessing by secondary school, they were like, we've got to put some support around you while you're in secondary school. And would that be, that's what I'm hearing correctly, isn't it? On that bridge
Yeah,
of time where they were going, oh, we're not, she's got friends, she's a nice girl, to we can see by the time you get to secondary school that she's got something, but she's also struggling.
yeah,
And your parents put that structure around you. And then you
yeah.
got that diagnosis at uni. And how was that in terms of support at uni, and how did you feel about that?
Well, it was amazing really, because suddenly it kind of, yeah, things made sense, and I was given software and equipment. And so I went from, the first year of getting kind of third class grades to 2-1, and consistently. And some of my essays actually even came out as first, and that was just really because of the, reasonable adjustments that had been put in place. So giving me a little bit of extra time in exams, kind of Dragon software, other software that just, mind mapping tool software that really just helped me to complete my studies.
What's Dragon software?
So it's like it's Dragon speaking. So it was. I don't think it'd been out that long when I was at university. We're talking, years ago now, and you would talk into it. So it was speech to text software.
Mm-hmm.
So I could brain dump all of what I was thinking onto paper, and then once it was down, I could then mind map it, and then I could, put it into a format of a structure of an essay. So that was amazing. That really made a huge difference in terms of, well, my grades. So just having that software helped me go from a third to a 2-1.
That's amazing.
And a high 2-1 as well. I almost got a first. So yeah.
So what did you get your degree in, your first degree?
So my undergrad was psychology and criminology.
Mm-hmm.
And then I went off, and after that, and did some traveling. I just decided to go off on my own. I went around Australia and Thailand, and met a crazy American, and that's a whole nother podcast and a whole nother story that I won't go into now. And I came back, and when I came back, I went back to university and did a postgrad psychology qualification, so I could get the British Psychological Society graduate membership, because at that time I wanted to pursue a career in psychology. And then I ended up, kind of doing various sort of job roles around community safety. So I kind of, drew on elements of the criminology as well as the psychology. But it was more kind of strategy, performance. I did work within the youth offending service, and, as well directly with children and young people, as part of social care.
Do you want to talk a bit more about that? About those job roles and how you move from a strategic role to a bit more hands-on?
Yeah, so, well, I kind of started off a bit more hands-on, and then I went to strategic roles, and then it was an interesting scenario where the unit that I was working in at the time they decided to close down the unit, and I was very grateful. I wasn't made redundant, but instead they decided to give me a job within the corporate core of the council. And so I ended up in the chief exec's office as a policy officer. And I found myself going to meetings where the councillors were arguing over who was going to pay for a lamppost because it was a two-tier district. And my ADHD, because I didn't know I had ADHD at that point, my ADHD brain just went, what am I doing here? This is just mind-numbingly boring and just doesn't give me any sense of purpose whatsoever. So I had a rethink. I thought, right, what do I want to do in my life? Okay, I decided that at that point I wanted to pursue a career in clinical psychology. When I was at university, there was the message that it's very competitive, very hard for people to get on that course. And so because of my previous history and my background, I just thought that's probably not for me, clinical psychology. That's for the intelligent people. That's for others. That I've got no hope of getting on that kind of course. So I kind of gave up on that. But by the time I'd kind of matured and reevaluated my life, I thought, actually, why not? Why can't I do that? So in order to do that, I had to then go back to frontline practice to get then a job as an assistant psychologist. So I was earning pretty well. I got a job with an old manager that I'd had previously when I worked within the youth offending service. And because they knew me essentially and they knew what my skills were, they gave me a job working within what was called the early intervention service at that time. And I was sort of running youth projects. I was doing parenting work with families. I was working directly with children and young people.
It might be worth just outlining for our friends across the pond or whoever's listening around the world what the role of that service is.
So it's kind of prevention. So it's part of sort of social care, but it's for those families or children where, it's before they meet that kind of child protection services threshold. So it was all kind of, it's about prevention, preventing families and children either going into care or being put on kind of child protection plans and things. Yeah.
And then from there, whereabouts were you in your own diagnostic journey?
So from there, I got a job within CAMS, the Child and Adolescent Mental Health Service. And I started working within a neurodevelopmental conditions pathway where we were doing assessments and treatment for children and young people with ADHD and autism. And it was very interesting experience because in doing the assessments, we would collect a developmental history, and I was kind of doing, getting this information, and it matched, there was a lot of crossover in terms of what my childhood was like and how I was as a child. And then we brought into the service this screening tool called a QB test. It's kind of used across the world now as a screening tool. It's kind of objective. It's got quite good psychometric, it's got quite good properties. In terms of a screening tool. And so when we brought it in, we were practicing on each other. And so I did this said QB test, and my scores came out as ADHD. So when I spoke to some of my colleagues who were trained psychiatrists and psychologists, and they kind of said, we can see that in you, that we definitely see that in you. So I thought, okay, because everything up until that point, all my challenges, all my difficulties, I had attributed to my dyslexia. I hadn't even considered ADHD because, we have this view of what ADHD is, young boys bouncing off the walls. And so I'd never really considered that in myself or that being a possibility until I started working in that service. So I kind of identified with, I think I've got ADHD. But I didn't actually then pursue a diagnosis until a few years later, after that, a couple of years later.
Was there a particular reason for hanging fire on that?
Well, I initially went to the local ADHD adult pathway, and they did some screening tools and asked my 70-year-old mother to do a screening tool. And they kind of looked at it and they said, oh, well, it doesn't quite meet the threshold for an assessment. And that was quite an interesting experience, because when I spoke to her afterwards about that, she had got mixed up with my sisters, some of the things that they had done and what I had done. So, because human memory is not that great, and we learn that in our psychology courses. So I really don't understand why they kind of thought that actually getting a memory recall of what your child was like, um, 30 years ago or 35 years ago is actually going to be very reliable information. And it was quite funny, because it opened up conversations of well, what about the times when I used to climb out of my bedroom window at night and go off out? And my mum obviously hadn't realised that I had been doing that, and was absolutely mortified to find out that that's what I had been up to and that's what I had been doing. But yeah, and so many other things that that I must have just made my parents worry so much about my safety growing up, because there was things they knew about and lots that they didn't know about that I got up to.
Until. So, in between that initial bit, how old were your children at that time when
So
you were exploring your own diagnosis?
yeah, so they were pretty young, and my son was going through, they both were having learning challenges at school as well. So I was pushing for educational assessments for them. I was very lucky in the school that they went to were quite supportive of that, because much like me when I was at school, I think because actually I wasn't stupid, and I was fairly bright, that I was able to mask quite a lot. So I was never perceived as bad enough to warrant the support or the assessment necessarily. And the same thing had occurred with my children as well. So, they were still kind of meeting the kind of expectations that you would, for that child. But I knew that there were, challenges, and certainly the school had recognised the reading, the spelling, very similar kind of to my presentation in terms of those learning needs and dyslexia. So they were quite good. So they had put forward for an educational psychology assessment. My son got diagnosed with a SPLD. I think the reason why that was because at the time, the educational psychologists weren't diagnosing dyslexia. So they would just make the diagnosis of a specific learning difficulty.
So that's what they called it, SPLD.
Yeah, SPLD. So it's a specific learning difficulty. And so I think they were just using that as the diagnosis. But all the teachers would kind of say, yeah, it's dyslexia. So he had that, and then my daughter was going through her assessment, and COVID hit. So we never quite finished the assessment. So we had a write-up of her assessment. So she wasn't actually diagnosed with anything, but if you look at her cognitive profile in the assessment, it was clear that she had a very, very spiky cognitive profile. And what we know from people with very spiky cognitive profiles is that there's likely to be some kind of neurodivergent thinking going on there, because, neurodiversity is a bell curve. You've got the majority of the population, the neurotypical, in the middle. And then, at the end of those bell curves, you've got people who just think, or whose brains work differently. And that's where the divergent thinking is. That's where the difference is. We're kind of at at either end of those bell curves, or not necessarily in terms of intelligence, but it's that difference, that divergence of thinking.
I've got a question about how, as you're going on this journey with your own children, with your own awareness of your very likely ADHD, how did that impact your relationship with your partner in any way?
Well, there was other stuff going on that side of things. Um, so he, so there was a suspicion of him having attention deficit.
Your partner?
Um, Yeah, yeah. So certainly, his mother would kind of recall what he was like as a child, and they would, she would say, oh, he's very much like my son. Just kind of daydreamy, would just sort of sit there and observe stuff, slow processing. Whereas my daughter was very much like me, like on the go, like fast, like busy mind, talkative, chatty, interrupts, that kind of stuff. Um, so so definitely there was indicators there, but um, just as we were kind of coming out of COVID, we had I was still having to work, and he was working as a gardener at the time. So we were trying to get him to do the bulk of the whole homeschooling, and he was struggling with it. He couldn't manage that. And there were other things that were going on with his memory that I just at the time thought, yeah, something's not right here. What is going on here? And so he eventually went to the doctor, and they, assessed and then sent him up to the memory clinic. And then he ended up getting a diagnosis of young onset Alzheimer's. So we were never really able to explore ADHD for him because of the Alzheimer's, really. So we're kind of on that journey as well. So yeah, and then obviously that was off the back of my own health scare, which was at the point when we met. So at that point, that was when I was working within the neurodevelopmental conditions pathway. I was working full time. I was working really hard. I'd taken a huge pay cut to pursue this career in clinical psychology. And every year I was applying, and I couldn't understand why it wasn't working for me, because I was doing all the right things. And, and then I got a diagnosis of eye cancer. So that was just like a real kind of bolt out of the blue shock. And again, it was a point in my life where I kind of reassessed, what is it I'm doing here? What do I want from my life? And decided to give up pursuing the clinical psychology, because my children were also getting to an age where I couldn't necessarily just uproot my whole family and go to a doctorate course halfway across the country. So I decided I went part-time, which financially was even more difficult. And yeah, so this was all kind of happening in amongst, well, that actually happened just before COVID hit. So, sometimes it's hard for me to kind of piece together exactly when time happens.
It was a lot in a quite short space of time, wasn't
It
it?
just was one thing after another. Yeah. So trying to keep the family going, keep the finances coming in, um, seeing to my husband's needs, my children's needs, my needs. It was a difficult time. It was difficult.
You were so remarkable through all of that, because that was about the time we met, and
Mm.
I know at the time I was going through quite a lot, and I'd started working rather than with counselling, but with a coach and mentor. And when was it you then started exploring your masters? Was it
Yes,
around that
it
same?
was around that time. Yeah, so I decided not to do the clinical. I actually applied for a doctorate in the counselling psychology, and that was interesting because the interview went really well. I had all the right qualifications because I'd also done a counselling and psychotherapeutic counselling diploma, in amongst everything as well. And the feedback they gave me was that I couldn't go on to that doctorate because because of my cancer diagnosis being so recent was what they said.
Yeah.
And again, I just thought, hang on a minute, like, who are you to say whether I'm ready for something or not? This is a 3-year doctorate program, and as part of that, you have to go through, therapy anyway. And actually, I was quite okay with my diagnosis, and I'd had my treatment, and I'd made changes in my life, and I'm a pretty positive person. I was getting on with things. And I guess their viewpoint on that was maybe I was in denial or something over that, because it was, it's a traumatic thing. It's difficult. And that's not to say I didn't struggle with it, and I didn't cry, and I didn't, have times where it felt difficult. But that's just not who I am. I just pick myself up and I get on with things. So then I was kind of like, oh my goodness, what am I going to do now? And this coaching course popped up, and in my impulsive ADHD way, I just went, right, okay, I'm going to do that. So I literally, within the same month, had applied for the course and was starting the course. And that was the journey to me. That was the start of my journey of becoming a coach.
But it wasn't just that, though, was it, Cara? Where did the PhD? Didn't the PhD come in at around a similar?
So the PhD came in because I'd always wanted to do a PhD, and part of that was, maybe I wanted to prove to others or to myself that, I can work at that academic level. I just always felt like it was something I wanted to do. But I thought, well, I'll do the masters, and then I can maybe go on and do a PhD, and maybe I'll do a PhD in the coaching, or something else. So I started doing the masters. I got to certificate level, and I'd done a couple of other modules as well on my way to the diploma. And a very dear friend of mine, so again, this was it all kind of coincided with COVID. So when COVID first hit, she had a very bad stroke, and it was a bit of a shock that this had happened to her, because she was very kind of peaceful living and a very kind of positive person, and she'd recovered from that, and she was gaining her strength back and building up her energy, and then she had a second stroke. And sadly, she didn't make it through the second stroke. She passed away. And again, it was a moment of reflection of, why do these things happen? What is this thing life is? What's it all about? I don't understand anymore. Like, why do these things happen to good people? So it was just one kind of powerful experience after another. And at that point, I thought, do you know what? Life's too short. I'm going to go and do a PhD, because I'm also passionate about animals. I'm going to go and do a PhD in green criminology around kind of animal rights, and focused on kind of the difference between how we categorize animals, of farmed animals and wild animals, and how we treat them. I thought, right, I'm going to go and do that, because why not? Life's too short. So I stopped my coaching. I'd already started my private practice at that point. And I was working as an ADHD and autism coach. It just felt like that was a good area for me to work in, because I had the lived experience, I had professional experience of working in that area. And I didn't feel tied down to a particular type of coaching. I was just working with a particular group of people. So I started building that practice. That was going really well. So I thought, right, well, I'll start the PhD. I'll do the PhD. I can use some credits from the PhD, so I don't have to do the research methods module for my master's. So all the time, my brain's going, how can I do this in the most efficient way? And so I did that. So started the PhD full time in the October. And then, the December was when my husband got his Alzheimer's diagnosis. So I plodded along for a bit of time after that. But I did a year full time, and then I just thought I can't do full time. I need to just, it needs to be part-time PhD, and I need to then work more because he'd stopped working. I needed to earn more money to support us all. And then in amongst that time, we moved as well. So I managed to uppack us and sell our house and move within 6 months. To
Yeah, you did, but you had a vision, didn't you? You that all of that kind of reset. You know that this is a bit of a pattern, I guess, that you're sharing. You know, there'll be a big thing, and you, as your friend, I've watched you go. Okay, let's stop. How do I want this next phase of my life to be? And then you do it, and it all seems to go click, 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 click. And you know, you had a very clear place in your mind, the lifestyle, you know, the big changes with your partner and what life would potentially look like for you as a family, and how you scaffold yourself as a
yeah,
family.
yeah.
um,
There's a
that's what I
fine
missed.
Yeah, there's a fine line between kind of anxiety
Mm.
and with an ADHD brain, there's this kind of imagining and thinking all the different possibilities of things that could either go well or go wrong, and that can be quite helpful in terms of future planning, um, and yeah, working things out. But there's a fine line with anxiety with that, because we can slip into worrying too much about things that might or might not happen in the
Mm.
future. So that that's always a kind of a fine balance. But there was definitely forward thinking in terms of what's life going to be like with caring for someone with Alzheimer's. What's it going to be like for my children? What do I need to do financially to make things more stable for us? And moving was what was needed, what was necessary to make that happen.
And this is all before you got your formal diagnosis,
Yeah,
all of
yeah.
this move. And the reason I'm just kind of highlighting that is where you were on your personal journey around how you support your own neurodivergence, and
Mm.
what that diagnosis brought in terms of support for you.
Yeah, so I put lots of lifestyle changes in place to help with my ADHD, but it got to the point where the cognitive load of everything I was carrying was so great that it was just really difficult to juggle it all. And I also had a sense that I was slipping into kind of perimenopause. There was changes hormonally going on for me in terms of estrogen, and I know that that can affect symptoms. So I felt like at this point in my life I maybe needed something pharmaceutical to just help me through this period, through this patch. Um, and I know that medication had worked very well for lots of other people. Sometimes it works well, sometimes it doesn't suit people. But I wanted to kind of almost experiment with that and see if that was something that might help me. And in order to do that, I needed a diagnosis. So I kind of, yeah, that's when I decided to pursue the diagnosis. I also, in terms of my own coaching, I just felt like I have this thing for me, this hang up around credibility. So I felt like, and I think it probably it probably goes back to my educational experiences. I feel like I have to have the qualifications. I feel like I have to have some kind of certificate or stamp to say that I am this person that I say I am. And part of that was, saying to people, well, I have a diagnosis of dyslexia and I have ADHD, but I hadn't had that formally diagnosed. So I felt almost like fraudulent in saying that, even though I knew. But there was this little fear, a little doubt of, but what if I'm not?
Yeah.
what if it's not this, and I've got it all wrong, and I haven't got ADHD at all, I'm just incompetent. These little fears kind of pop up, don't they? And I think lots of people going through whether to seek a diagnosis or not, will perhaps experience some of those similar things too.
Just right, all of these academic achievements, because this is the thing I'm hearing over and over again, that what I'm hearing is that early childhood, oh, she's a nice girl, but she's not that bright.
Yeah.
Even though from secondary school, you got that support from your parents around you to get you to uni, to get you to and you got yourself to uni into, strategic roles, to masters, to PhD. There's that, just look at how much you've achieved over that time. And, when we think of that little girl who was, and I think this can happen with our own children, even though we're getting a lot more support around our children early on and in the schools, there's still that, I see it in our own child, that kind of worthiness, or I don't know, affirmation needed. That
Yeah.
there's still something around that still marks us and shapes us somehow. But just really to celebrate all your amazing achievements. And not only did you start practicing as a coach, you saw a big need and that kind of flourished. Do you want to
Yeah.
share a bit more around that?
Well, yeah.
Sounds
So
like amazing.
the coaching. So I ended up, because I'd gone back part time for the PhD, I kind of thought, I need to finish the masters. I need to get that done. So I managed to get the MPhil level. And so I was able to get that research methods module credited. So I only had the dissertation to go back to do. Actually, I had two. I had another module and a dissertation. So I did an independent studies module, which I did around neurodiversity coaching, and then I did my dissertation. And so I've just managed to get my master's, and in a crazy manner, I did that at the same time as doing my PhD. I did actually put the PhD on pause for 6 months while I finished my dissertation. So I did give myself a little bit of a break, because life's busy. And in amongst all of that, my private practice was growing. It was, I had wait lists. And I felt guilty because I thought, I can't help all these people. I don't have time to help all of these people. So my supervisor at the time said, well, why don't you take on some associates and, just, see if you can refer some people on. So Neurodivergence was then born. And that's been a bit like a baptism of fire. I mean, it's kind of taken off. It's like, I describe it as like a tsunami that's just pushing me along. Like, I don't even have any say in the matter. It keeps pushing me along, and it's growing. And all the coaches that we have on there now are amazing. They're all brilliant. I make sure they're of a good quality, and that they're able to really support people, but they're also individuals in their own right, and I am passionate about them developing their own businesses. It's not about I want people to I want to advocate for independence, and I do that in terms of when I'm working with people. So I've developed all that as well at the same time. So it's a bit bonkers really when I think about everything I've done.
I know, and we won't mention what we were talking about in terms of charities just yet.
No.
I know you've got one vision after another and you do make it happen. So I think it might be helpful to explore a little bit around my own personal experience, the difference between coaching and counselling, and how that supports you. Supports one as a neurodivergent person. I know from my own experience, I'd go to it was really overwhelmed. I was struggling with sort of being offered antidepressants and looking at them thinking, but that's not going to sort out this overwhelm, and just not taking it. And whenever, I mean, people would often say it's probably because I hadn't found the right counsel. And I know when I was very distressed, having sort of a trauma informed counselor was very helpful. I had a very helpful transactional analysis counselor not long after my father's death, but that was really interactive. We would kind of go through a session and he would explain these interactions. You're seeking for adult to adult connection, but we can interact between as like parent and child, or adult and child, and what you're seeking all the time is that adult to adult connection between peers. But beyond that, I found counselling outside of a crisis, there was still the struggle and overwhelm. And for me, when things were really, really tricky, having a coach and mentor in one, so it wasn't just the coaching, there was also an element of mentoring, that was transformational for me in terms of emotional self-regulation. And learning not to be at the mercy of my emotions. That was probably the biggest shift change. And then it just takes a lot of work. But for you, Cara, I'd love to hear what your experience and thoughts are around the comparison with counselling and coaching, and what, with all of your background, you've ended up with the coaching rather than the counselling.
So, I think with the coaching for me just feels like and what you're going to do about it. How can we change that? Whereas the counselling, there's definitely a place for counselling to process emotions, to, explore those on a really kind of deep level. But there's no then what? Okay, what are you going to do? And you might address, like CBT might address certain thinking patterns, but sometimes when you have a neurodivergent brain, it's going to do what it's going to do. So sometimes there's no stopping it, so having more practical strategies is more helpful than trying to think differently, because you already think differently. And so I think that's the difference that I see. But even within coaching, coaching within the neurodivergent kind of field is not the same. We need to kind of go beyond the traditional coaching models. Coaching, how that historically has evolved, it was white middle class men in business, trying to be better leaders, and so it kind of needs to continue to evolve, and the coaching needs to adapt to the needs of the coachee. And sometimes that might slip into a bit more kind of mentoring. Sometimes it might be not necessarily directive, but you might say, it might be less exploratory. It might be, well, here's some strategies you could try. Some might work for you, some might not. Because sometimes people are coming to you because they want some strategies, they want some help. They don't, and you want to help them to work out what's going to help them and work for them. But sometimes you need to give people an idea, a menu, what to choose from, because people don't know. It's not, if someone says, well, what do you need? I don't know what I need. What kind of question is that? It's really abstract. Really abstract question.
I would have bought it by now.
Exactly. If I knew that, I would have done it, and I would have thought of it, and that would have been that. So I think even within coaching models, we need to think differently about them as well. We need to think about intersectionality. We need to think about the context that we are living in and our lives are in. Sometimes no amount of coaching or counselling is going to change a broken system. If you think about children going through education, yes, there is lots of support now. There's lots of support for people at work, yet we're still seeing the highest numbers of exclusions for children with neurodivergent conditions. We're still seeing, unemployment rates, the highest for, particularly autistic people, have the worst kind of, unemployment rates. They're just not being employed. They're not being given the opportunity. They're not being, supported within the workplace. So they end up burning out. The health indicators, education, if we look at every single domain, there is discrimination and barriers. And don't get me wrong, we've come a long way, just even in the past 10 years, but we've still got a long way to go yet. And if we think about it in the context of physical disabilities, there was a time when we didn't have lifts in buildings, and people with physical disabilities were, and they still are, don't get me wrong, discriminated against, but there is more acceptance and understanding around their needs.
Yeah.
And we've got a long way to go with hidden disabilities.
Yeah. And just to keep on that point, I know I've been in an ADHD specific group coaching session for my own personal development.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it wasn't until maybe 4 weeks in, I had the eureka moment when I realized, although I've been really working hard to support kind of equity and access for our child,
Mm-hmm.
actually been trying to fix my own brain.
Right.
And I hadn't appreciated that at all, because, trying to find strategies to support the way my mind works, there was definitely an element of, and then I'll be normal, then I can function like everyone else.
Yeah.
Rather than when I think about how I look at our child and just thinking, right, what does he need to be able to stay within the mainstream system, because that's
Mm-hmm.
all we have right now, still going through an EHCP process, in order for him to be able to do the things that he wants to do. He loves learning.
Yeah.
And then we'll still get really frustrated, but just to support that. But thinking that I was going to fix myself somehow. And even though I had a sense of frustration of being continually asked in an outside school thing, well, what else can we do to support him, basically, so he will comply within this
So he'll
situation?
fit in. Yeah.
He'll fit in. And I was just thinking, his brain is like that. His behavior, we can only do so much, but then that impulsivity is part of who he is.
Yeah.
And that won't change, even though there's a support around medication, it doesn't stop. But what it does for him within a school context is it gives him the mental capacity for emotional self-regulation.
Yeah.
And yeah, so that the disability thing, in some of the conversations I've had just with friends and peers around, this is often given. If you were to put a wheelchair ramp in so that someone could access the building in their wheelchair, and they
Yeah.
were accessing the building fine, you say, oh, they're doing fine. You wouldn't then take away the ramp.
No.
And it was the same, through the transition from primary to secondary. We had such amazing support. I can't rave about his school enough, primary school. And they really sort of scaffold him amazingly, and he was coping really well. And
Yeah.
they did so much for the handover, but the transition was not handled well administratively. And because he handled himself well for the first couple of weeks, it was like, oh, he's fine.
Yeah.
He was fine until he wasn't fine.
And they have a system where they have to see the child fail and struggle before they'll put things in place.
Yeah.
So, how is that, helpful to our children? Oh, let's make sure they are actually going to fail. Let's let them fail. And then we'll put in support, because then we can approve the funding.
Before I forget, we definitely should talk about this. So this is a UK podcast. We're filming in UK. So all of these references we're making about government-funded schools, and it's probably worth mentioning the big takeaway that I know that you mentioned when we were prepping from the show, like the one big bit of advice you would give to someone with a diagnosis of ADHD about access to, I'll let you finish the sentence.
So in terms of like access to work, or
yes, that one.
Yes. Well, so in the UK, we have a government-funded program called Access to Work, and this is designed to provide grants to people with disabilities or disabled people. It doesn't have to be specifically neurodivergent, any disability, and or mental health condition as well, it includes, to provide a grant to help them within their employment, either employed or self-employed. And as part of that, one of the things that they can access and get funded is coaching. And it's really, really helpful for, some people within employment to have a coach that can guide them through, if they're starting a new employment, guiding them through that transition of that new employment. Sometimes there are changes, organizational changes, so can support people through that as well. Coaches can help in so many different ways, and it's not just within the employment sector, but now coaches are starting to be used within health as well. So the funding structures for those are slightly different, and also mentors are used within education and funded through a disabled student allowance. So yeah, we're getting better, but there's still very much, we're swimming against the tide. We are trying to support people in a broken system, and I think that is across the world. I don't think that's just necessarily related to UK policy and practice. I think there is a systemic issue in terms of how people are viewed and treated, more widely in the Western kind of world anyway. I'm not sure how it works in other kind of cultures, but certainly within the UK, we have an expectation for people to fit in with the status quo. And what we don't do is explore individuality, creativity, all of those kind of other parts of being and thinking are almost weeded out. And you see it in the education system as well. The art classes are going, the design technology classes are going, the more practical applications of learning and jobs even are going. And so the architecture of our society is not neuro-friendly. And until that changes, we're always going to be on the periphery. We're always going to be trying to prove ourselves, trying to be heard, trying to be listened to. So we still need lots of changes.
And you're part of that change, my friend.
And I want to be part of that change, yeah. So I want to do that, not just working individually with people, but, at a wider kind of government policy level as well. I want to advocate for people's needs and for policy change, for societal change. Yeah. So, if I can create some little ripples of change, and hopefully they'll turn into big waves.
They will. Another
I'll be very
tsunami coming. Watch out, world. Cara's coming.
I'm on my way. I'm on the warpath.
So much for being so open and just sharing your life story with people. And with both of us, just want to say we hope what we've shared has resonated with you in some way. Um, and do check out Even the Dog Has ADHD and Cara, and go to the podcast page where you can find out more about Cara and Neurodivergence. And I'm sure Cara will give us a load of wonderful academic papers if you want to read up as well and equip yourself a bit more.
I have
Um,
one actually. Hopefully, will be published. Yeah, in a few months' time, hopefully.
Brilliant.
So
Well, that will
yeah.
probably coincide with this being published. So thank you so much for listening, and we'll draw the today's episode to an end. For Even the Dog Has ADHD, because apples never fall far from trees, and it's never just one. Bye.
Bye.